you very much for the invitation to attend. My remarks are a lot shorter than the others, and they're a little different in that the organizers kindly asked me to come and talk about some experiences that we have had in Canada in preparation for the need to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And so my remarks are going to be largely around our movement towards being able to adapt to certain aspects of climate change in Canada. My remarks are based on the work of a number of people, one of whom is in the room today, and of course many of the publications of these people. So it's a very complex issue and one that has involved many experts from around the country. I think that it's important to recognize that we're at a fairly critical stage when it comes to addressing climate change right now. James Hansen from NASA and Nicholas Stern, they talk about the concept of mitigation and adaptation together. We have some decisions to make as a global society, and if we choose to, of course, mitigate a lot now, then the requirement for future generations, our grandkids, to adapt is less. If we decide to mitigate less, then our children are going to have to adapt more. And given that the current GHG emissions are continuing to grow and beyond the most extreme scenario that we're now working with, I expect that we're probably headed down the road to adaptation. So when it comes to adaptation, we fought for years in the boardrooms. It was all about mitigation, mitigation, mitigation. And when the word adaptation came up, we were told to go sit in the corner because that was not part of the puzzle. And then all of a sudden adaptation is on the table, and jurisdictions around the world are scrambling to put adaptation policies and programs into place. Recognizing that adaptation is no simple thing, there's a little bit of a process involved in actually getting on with an adaptation program. Now here in Ontario, we're primarily driven by a climate plan called Climate Ready, and it instructs or commits my agency, the Ministry of Natural Resources, to get out there and develop some tools and techniques around vulnerability assessment in support of the development of adaptation strategies at a variety of scales. And this is occurring across the country as well in various jurisdictions. Now at the national level, the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers has assembled a number of people into a technical advisory committee, and that technical advisory committee is working on a number of products that are about to be released, and I'm going to shamelessly promote some of them as I work through this talk. But one of the important parts of the work that the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers technical group has been working on is the development of an adaptation process. How do we actually get on with the business of adapting to the impacts of climate change given all of the uncertainties? And this is an example of the type of process that we've been looking at under the auspices of the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers, and other jurisdictions have been looking at it as well. There are variations of this, but most of the examples that I'm going to talk about today are based on this type of framework. And in Ontario, we have been using this approximate framework to test out an approach to developing vulnerability assessments and adaptation options, specifically in the Lake Simcoe watershed last year, and more recently this year in the Northern Clay Belt up in northeastern Ontario. So I'm going to suggest that adaptation to climate change is a thoughtful process involving a series of steps. It's an iterative process involving a series of steps that are also iterative, and it takes us from asking a series of questions right through to finding solutions and implementing those solutions. Fundamentally, we're finding that asking the right questions is perhaps one of the most important aspects of getting ready to adapt to the impacts of climate change. Due to budget constraints and just our level of expertise, getting the questions right up front, or getting a lot of them right up front, is really important to us in terms of where we want to focus our research and how we want to engage our practitioners in the actions of adaptation. And I think that from a an impact, a catastrophic loss perspective, I think this is important as well. Although I should say that today I'm going to talk about a systems approach of which disasters such as fire and flood are one, albeit important part of the whole process. So step one talks about, suggests that we need to sit down and figure out what we're all about, where we want to go, what are the types of questions that we need to ask ourselves in order to move on. In fact, are we an organization or a system of organizations that is in fact equipped to adapt? Is this an assumption that we can all make sitting in this room, that we know what adaptation is and that we have the wherewithals to do it? So one of the products that the Canadian Council on Forest Ministers is about to release is a document that actually asks some of these questions and provides a bit of a template of questions to help organizations work their way through a series of questions to figure out, even if they're in a position to engage in adaptation or support the development of an adaptation program in whatever spatial unit or jurisdiction that is up for discussion. And it's basic things like space and time. I mean, we all work in space and time, so what are the spatial and temporal elements that we need to work in? Do we have the right principles and values, the right organizational structure? For example, some of us work in hierarchies, others of us work in loose assemblages of organizations, when in fact maybe a combination in some type of matrix structure where decisions around legislation can be made at the top and where there's flexibility to work on the ground in the communities at the bottom can all happen at the same time. And it just increases our chances of being a little more coordinated than we have in the past. So looking at our institutional structure and the flexibility associated with that in terms of being able to move forward in an adaptive context, it's argued in this paper is perhaps an important consideration as we move forward. Same with partnering. I mean, all of us have a long history of partnership, very, very important. The question is, do we have the right partners and where are we going with them? Because they're like sharks. If you don't feed them and they can't move forward, they're going to die. And we don't want our partnerships to languish. It's really important that they be supported and they be robust and that they provide the support and the answers that we need. Just like asking ourselves whether or not we're out there giving the right messages. And if we're not, then we need to sort of find out what those right messages are and use them. For those at the back, it says, this sign has sharp edges, don't touch the edges on this sign, and then it says also, the bridge is out ahead. So it's all about the right message, and we've heard a lot about that today, and that's good stuff. It's just that there's a lot of misinformation going around on the climate change front, and it's really important that we're careful about the messages that we develop and we promote out there. So step two suggests that our scientists and our technical people need to actually be able to tell us how climate has changed to where we are now and whether or not any impacts have occurred already and what that means to us. So how have we been exposed? Are the natural assets for which we have responsibility sensitive to that exposure? And are they able to adapt? And if they're not, how vulnerable are they? And if they're vulnerable, then do we need to be thinking about these particular vulnerabilities in the context of developing an adaptation strategy or a way forward? An example is eastern hemlock, which requires moist, cool sites. If it's exposed to drought or any long periods of dryness, it's highly sensitive to that. It doesn't compete well at the seedling stage. If there are lots of winters with low snow and deer can browse them, then they're unable to compete. So this type of species in a changing climate where precipitation would be drier is of course vulnerable. And so you would immediately rank that species up as high vulnerability and one of perhaps many species or one of perhaps many types of infrastructure or one of perhaps many types of ecosystems that need to be looked at in a special way in the context of adaptation as we move forward. And I don't want to leave you with the impression that it's all that simple and that biologists have all the answers. If you look at some of the work that's going on around the potential impacts of climate change on moose populations in Ontario and beyond, You can see that with the northward movement of white-tailed deer, which carries the brain worm, which also brings moose, or which also brings increased populations of wolves, which then influence the moose through the transmission of brain worm, through more predation pressure from wolves, as well as increased longevity of ticks during the winter by virtue of the fact that it's warmer, impacts an animal from a variety of different perspectives, and so it's quite often very difficult to actually assess right out what the vulnerability of a species or an entity is because of all of these other factors. So it's not a simple one-off type of decision that we have to make, which tells us that this is a complicated issue. It's one that we have to continually monitor, and there's a research component here that needs to be continually supported if we want some answers in terms of the natural assets that we feel are important and that we want to carry on with into the future. So from a natural resource management perspective, and this is the sort of the broad scale view of the world, I work for a natural resources agency which has responsibility for fisheries and wildlife and forestry and parks and all of those good things. And given our mandate, we're very interested in looking at the impacts of climate change and the adaptations to climate change in the context of genetics, species, and ecosystems. Or ecosystems, species, and genetics, and how those are all interlinked, because climate change impacts at different scales all the way down. And our responses may be at the ecosystem level, or it may be a genetic response in terms of moving a particular population of trees to a better site. So I would suggest that in the context of natural asset management, forest management, fisheries, there are a complex series of questions that we're asking our scientists to look at. And we know that there are going to be winners and losers out there from an aquatics perspective as temperatures warm and our lakes warm. We know that warm water species like smallmouth bass are going to increase their access to new thermal habitat, and cold water species such as lake trout are going to lose thermal habitat, so there's going to be a shift. There are some management implications to that, such as how do we organize our fishing regulations? Do we need to change the length of the season, the lakes that are fished, and how those lakes are fished by virtue of the changing dynamics that result from climate change, the changing dynamics which are inevitable in many cases. From a terrestrial perspective, it's the same thing. And we already are seeing a number of critters that are intimately tied to temperature and precipitation regimes. They're beginning to move, beginning to challenge the thermal line that has historically dictated where they fit in Ontario. For example, the opossum has made a very significant inroad into Ontario and is now marching north in response to warmer January temperatures. It's an omnivore. It feeds on a whole bunch of things, so it can be quite well adapted to life in Ontario. And so our people are interested in this species and all of the other mammal species that are starting to change their distribution, and trying to look at the implications of that in terms of the spread of disease, human-wildlife problems, et cetera, et cetera. Even in terms of sort of understanding how to react to these critters when people encounter them and they don't quite know what they're encountering. This is real, by the way. I'm told. So those are some of the issues that we're confronted with at the species level, whether it's tree or fish or mammal or bird. But at the ecosystem level, there are all sorts of impacts occurring as well. And of course, as Mike Flanagan eruditely talked about today, fire is going to be a huge issue. It's a disturbance. It's a factor at the ecosystem level, and it's going to be an important part of how we develop our adaptation strategies across the country. Excuse me for the Ontario bias. Ontario is the center of the universe, so I have no choice because I live here. But there are many examples from across the country similar to the one that I'm showing here. This is Rob McAlpine, who has worked with Mike and many others for years He's our fire guru, and he went back and had a look at 30 years worth of statistics back into the 60s, and determined that in Ontario, our fire season has increased by at least a week in the far northwest and up to a day or two in the northeast, suggesting that in terms of adaptation strategies, while it looks like we may have to think about the impacts of fire across the province, we need to be particularly aware of the potential impacts of fire in northwestern Ontario. So from species to ecosystems and back again, it makes for a very complex world. So in assessing current vulnerability, we try and sort of understand the biology or the engineering of the infrastructure, whatever we're looking at, in order to determine whether or not something's going on now, and decide whether or not it's important enough to sort of start doing something about it or keep an eye on it into the future. If you look at some work, for example, that was done in Ottawa by Dan Scott from the University of Waterloo a few years ago, he has looked at the continuing trend in the erosion of winter and the impacts of that erosion on winterlude, and various other sort of winter type of events that Ottawa is famous for, including skating on the canal. And as a result of that work, I mean, one of the conclusions that's come out of it was that the winter season for winterlude is inconsistent, and you need to sort of adapt the way in which you run winterlude to make that happen. And so what they've done is they, organized it over a couple of weekends to sort of maybe improve their chances of success. They've got all sorts of new indoor activities in the event that winter goes down, and they've got a whole bunch of kids in town that need something to do, and the list goes on and on. The point is that, as a species, we are an adaptable species. That's what we're here. That's why we're here now. It's unfortunate that we like to take ourselves to the precipice all the time, but at any rate, we're good at adaptation, and we have lots of examples of that now. It's a question of putting a climate lens on it and looking at adaptation through that lens, given the uncertainties of what our climate will look like into the future. So this is what step 3 is all about. Step 3 is about strategic thinking, strategic visioning, trying to figure out what's coming ahead in the future. Now, there's no way that we can predict the future, of course. However, there are pictures that we can draw, forward-thinking pictures that we can draw based on simulation models, for better or for worse, that we use to project temperature and precipitation, climate through time. And this is an important strategic visioning tool that has evolved in the last few years, and is proving to be an important part of an adaptation approach to management. In Ontario, we have used a number of models for a number of years to engage people in forward-thinking strategic discussions. We simply go into a meeting and say, well, what if your world was 2 degrees warmer and it was drier? Or what if your world is 3 degrees warmer and it's wetter? What does that mean to you in the community? Because, by the way, I'm of the opinion, and I think a lot of my colleagues are, that managing for climate change and adapting to climate change is most likely going to be most successful if it happens at the community level. It's right down at the community level. That's where it needs to get done. And so being able to go into the communities and think and vision strategically is a critical part. So, as we all know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has developed a series of climate models and a series of scenarios of human behavior, because, of course, we don't know how humans are going to behave over the next 100 years or so. So we don't know if our greenhouse gas levels are going to be a little higher, a lot higher, or out of sight, or if they're going to stabilize. What that does is that puts all of us in a situation of having to make a lot of guesses. The IPC is suggesting that perhaps we need to be thinking about an annual average temperature increase of somewhere between 2 and 6 degrees. For some wildlife species, just a 1 degree change makes a huge difference. It can either destroy that species or provide an additional sort of 100 kilometers of climate envelope for it to potentially survive in. And as a result of that, and having that large temperature range, there's huge uncertainty in the way in which, within the context of that, we we asked a number of scientists to come forward and focus and do vulnerability assessments on a number of themes. Now, historically, we've done two sort of vulnerability assessments, and we've gone after scientists who had data and information. So there are a number of gaps in the themes, of course. Anyways, in this case, we asked Len Hunt, who's a socioeconomist, he's a research scientist in Thunder Bay, to look at the potential impacts on snowmobiling, cross-country skiing, ice fishing, etc. Potential impacts of a changing climate on the tourism industry through time in the Clay Belt area. And you can see from his graph that he's suggesting that under an A2 and slightly less in GHG-rich model, there will be a fairly steady decline in the snow base and in the availability of ice for ice fishing and snowmobiling. Maybe somewhere between a 10 to a 25% reduction in the length of the season. It's not catastrophic for this particular part of Ontario. It simply means that the season will be reduced and that people engaged in these types of activities may have to go elsewhere or further north. But if we were to do this same model down on Lake Simcoe, the story would be completely different, very different in terms of the potential loss of a significant winter base given where it is in terms of latitude. So we commissioned a number of studies like this for the Clay Belt and had the scientists attend a workshop, and they delivered at that workshop a statement of impact and vulnerability where possible. And on the basis of those statements, which covered off everything from wildlife to fisheries to peatlands, socioeconomics, as I mentioned, we then used those vulnerability statements to start to get at this whole question of risk. And I know that there's a huge science around risk analysis, and there's all sorts of quantitative stuff and Markov chain analysis, and it's just massive. We here, given what we had to work with, did a very simple risk analysis process, and it was simply taking the vulnerability assessments and identifying the consequences of that to various assets, and then establishing a likelihood that that consequence is going to happen. So in the course of the workshop, and then in the course of actually sitting down with the core team, we got to the point of developing a list of consequences, and then with consequences and likelihood estimates, and again, these are just estimates, we were able to sort of develop a priority list of the types of assets in this particular ecosystem that we think are probably going to be impacted by climate change. And in this particular scenario, this is by 2050. And so you can see that cold water fish species may be extirpated from some streams. That's at the higher end of the risk. And there may be a change in the spring stream flow, peak flow, which of course has implications to amount of water available in the summertime. And the list goes on. The point being is that these types of assessments, as simple and elemental as they are, they give people in the communities an idea of the types of things that are important to them that may be at risk and how they may be at risk, and they provide a platform in which to move forward and have a discussion about what to do about it, if there are things to be done about it. And that was basically step 5. And so we took all of these risk statements and, well, the core planning team. This particular project, by the way, was led by 2 ladies in M&R, Jenny Gleason and Rochelle Levon, and I think they did just a great job. At any rate, they moved the risk statements into a computer program. It was a flash cube program that sort of allows you to identify adaptation strategies in response to those risk statements in one step, and then in another step it asks you to prioritize those adaptation options. And through that process, which was an online exercise done, and we also offered up a GPS unit for completing the questionnaire. Actually, the response rate was really good once we added in the GPS unit. So if you're going to do this and you've got a little bit of incentive, it really helps in terms of feedback. At any rate, we wound up with many, many options, and this is an example of the top three from some of those options. For example, from the aquatics one, develop protection measures for groundwater areas and estuaries within the clay belt. So that's a land use planning priority, and it's something that the land use planners will receive as a recommendation in moving forward. So once you've got your adaptation strategies and options and you've got them prioritized, then of course some decisions have to be made as whether or not you're going to move forward with them. And if you do, then they're implemented and mainstreamed. Of course, it's not over then. The trick here is to implement them and then monitor them to determine whether or not the decisions that you've made are in fact working, and have a system in place to detect change, to detect error, and have a decision-making process and a governance process in place that allows people to identify the error and then make the correction and get on with it in terms of monitoring again. This is a lousy this is a lousy graph. I did it, and it's just an attempt to show that one of the questions we have is okay, so we have monitoring programs out there on the landscapes and waterscapes, and we look at certain things and how they're changing. 5 years, a 5-year period seems to be an important sort of period, and the question is, well, is that too long in terms of climate change, particularly given that we're already into some change with some species now, particularly if we're concerned about invasive species. And so we have some issues to resolve around monitoring and whether or not we can come up with the money to intensify monitoring if that's the way in which we want to go. So monitoring is a critically important aspect of an adaptation, an adaptive approach to dealing with climate change. And it's also about learning and taking that learning and putting it into the system and not forgetting. And losing the momentum around extreme events, for example. I come from Peterborough, so I mean we're flood city, and it just seems like we have an emergency response team, and it's very, very good and very sophisticated, and we know they're at work. And what it takes is a group like that to sort of be in the community and talking about these potential impacts on an ongoing basis with the residents so that they know what's up and where they're at risk. And of course, a data and information management system is also key to this. I think that in Ontario, we have a very good one, and it's critical to be able to maintain this and to tap into it. So this is my second last slide, and I hate to sort of end off with a whole bunch of words because I'm not a words guy. But as we move through various meetings and workshops and experiences over the last number of years, there seem to be some key points that are bubbling to the surface. They're not complex points, but they keep coming back time and time again. First of all, if you have any programs that are based on the assumption, and for which decisions are based on the assumption of a stable climate, you perhaps need to go back and think about that, because from a forestry perspective, for example, we can't do that anymore. From a fisheries perspective, we can't do that anymore, and I expect that there are lots of other sectors out there that are in the same boat. Every species in every ecosystem is going to respond in a unique way. This is one of the tough things about being on the biological side, because most species are connected to other species. Most species are probably connected to 2, 3, 4, or 5 species. And yet each species is going to respond to a changing climate uniquely, meaning that many of these species are going to come uncoupled. We have no idea if they're all going to survive, if they're all going to die, how they're going to react, what's going to happen. The point being is that if there was ever a time to try and understand what's going on out there and to be on top of it, now is it. Now is the time. I think, there's new and potentially increased threats to human health and well-being. Lyme disease is a classic example. There's now a couple of papers out there that suggest that malaria is now back and going to be an issue in Ontario that we need to be thinking about. It's important, right down to heat stress in the cities. There are human health issues associated with this, and we need to be thinking about them. This whole idea of sustainability, we commit to sustainable forest management, we commit to sustainable fisheries management, we commit to sustainable management in many sectors. Given the change that we've seen so far and given the anticipated change, are we comfortable with our commitment to sustainability in the context that we've previously made that commitment? And we need to be thinking about that in how we make decisions going forward. I also believe that making decisions about climates that haven't arrived yet are very difficult. And I just think that as a society we need to ask ourselves if we are organized in a way that allows all of us to be engaged in some of these difficult discussions that we're going to have ahead of us in terms of known and potential impacts coming down the road and how we make decisions. So perhaps at all levels of government everywhere in the world, we need to begin to think about how our governance structures and how we make decisions in terms of trying to respond to climate change, which is only one of a number of cumulative impacts, which is sort of eating away at ecological health and well-being, and of course the health and well-being of us as a society. I think that civic duty is fundamental to addressing climate change, and I'm not convinced that we have a level that will allow us to move forward in a meaningful way now. I think that we've got all sorts of groundwork out there, lots of people engaged, but would suggest that we need to go back and look at that one as well. And last but not least, every town and every city, every industry is going to be confronted with a unique suite of climate-induced impacts by virtue of the fact that they all exist in different ecosystems around the province and around the country, which are also going to respond to climate change in a unique way. And that's why I argue that decisions that we make around adaptation, whether it's on the fire side, the forest sector side, the fisheries side, as much as possible, it needs to be done at the local level, involving all levels of government and lots of involvement by the community as a whole. And I think that that's the end. Thank you. And I know it's coffee break, and I'm sure people want to move on to coffee. But
one quick question.
Sorry, Paul, can't let you get off that easy. Just one observation that maybe if you could comment on. Everybody talks about climate change as being kind of a gradual shift. You know, we're going to see species moving gradually from one place to another. But I'd like you to comment on what's happened in BC with the mountain pine beetle and how maybe some of these climate shifts will not be gentle and slow. So we may see them in fire and past and other disturbances much more quickly.
Excellent point. And I think that there are points at which a species is going to respond, that many species will respond in a big or a small way. I think the mountain pine beetle is one. It's a classic example of where it was able to find itself in a situation where it could survive through the winter, and that was due to warming. Same as possums in Ontario. They're headed north because they're able to escape that critical minus 12 degrees C January temperature. And so where we encounter situations like that, and where you have an R strategist species like that are capable of rapidly reproducing and moving forward very quickly, we're going to see these types of catastrophic events. And this is also going to happen at the ecosystem level, and it actually already has. If you look at some of the forested ecosystems in Alaska, which traditionally have been underlain with ice, in some of those systems, the ice has melted, the forest has collapsed in on itself, and now it's a wetland. So a forested ecosystem has flipped and been reconfigured into a wetland, an aquatic ecosystem. So I think at all scales we're going to see these types of moves that happen really quickly. And the other thing to remember too is that ecosystems are not going to move north as an ecosystem, because every species in that ecosystem is going to respond in a unique way. So we're probably looking at the formation of new and novel systems. And I've heard some experts come forward, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, suggest that perhaps over the next few hundred years we might be in for a weedy future, simply by virtue of the individual movement of species. So I'm not sure if that does it, but you're right. Yep.
We could see the same.
It's a combination of sort of slow change and catastrophic situations.